Good afternoon. Defending Creation Seminar before, during, and after the Genesis flood. We are ending Series 1 today entitled Before the Genesis Flood. Lesson 1, we talked about 6 days of creation, age of the earth, 6 days versus billions of years, Big Bang and evolution, 6 days versus billions of years, the influence on the church. Last week, dinosaurs in the Bible, and we'll conclude Series 1 today with the pre-flood world and climate versus what we have today. Next week, for the month of December, we will dive into Series 2, Defending the Genesis Flood. And next week's Lesson 1 is entitled Compelling Evidence for a Global Flood. How did the world get flooded? And we'll go into that in detail. Lesson 2, Genesis flood, washing away millions of years. And then Lesson 3, addressing Noah's Ark's questions. We'll talk about how large was the ark? Is a large wooden ark seaworthy? How many animals were on the ark? Were dinosaurs on the ark? And then Lesson 4, the last lesson of this series, and we'll take it into January 7th with that 2-week break. Global flood legends. Today's lesson, pre-flood world and climate versus today. 3-point outline. We'll start off with who was Cain's wife. And then we'll dive into the canopy model. And then most of today's lesson will be talking about the pre-flood world. What type of weather occurred before the flood? How did people live so long? Did people actually live to be 900 like the Bible says? Did tropical trees grow in the Arctic? Was primitive man actually intelligent? Were there giants? And how large were the animals? So I'd like to acknowledge these creation groups. I used a lot of material from Creation Science Evangelism. If you ever heard of Kent Hovind, Dr. Kent Hovind, I used a lot of his material for today's talk. Also, Answers in Genesis, I have a video from Ken Ham. He made a joke about, he talked about so much about Cain's wife, he didn't even get to talk about his own wife. Also, a little clip from Institute for Creation Research. So let's start with what the Bible teaches. Genesis 4, verse 1 and 2, and it states, Now Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Verse 2, Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was the keeper of the sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Let's skip to verse 8. Now Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. And then Genesis 4 verse 11. So now, this is God talking to Cain. So now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth. And then verse 16, Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And he built a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Now, I highlighted Cain knew his wife. The word knew means to have sexual relations. So Cain had sexual relations with his wife. Note that Cain was married before he went to the land of Nod. He did not find a wife in Nod. Cain knew his wife in Nod. Make that distinction. And Nod means wandering in Hebrew. So Cain went to the land of wandering. It was not full of people. And John Calvin had a quote in John Calvin's commentaries on the first book of Moses called Genesis in volume 1. And he said, from the context, we gather that Cain, before he slew his brother, had married a wife. Otherwise, Moses now would have related something respecting his marriage. Let's read further, Genesis chapter 5, verse 4, and it talks about Adam after he begot Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years, and he had sons and daughters. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote, "The number of Adam's children, as says the old tradition, was 33 sons and 33 daughters." So the Bible really doesn't tell us how many sons and daughters Adam and Eve had, but considering their long span, because if you go to the next verse, Genesis 5, verse 5, so all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. So considering Adam lived 930 years, I'm sure Eve lived just as long, it could be consistent that they had many children. So who was Cain's wife? Any ideas in the audience after that context? Sister. Yep. Because there was nobody else. They married sisters. Also, just think of it. Adam and Eve were born perfect. They didn't have any bad genes. So the next generation was close to perfect. Would be no genetic breakdown if you married your sister. But they had to back then. And I'll play a 2-minute clip from Ken Ham where he talks about Cain's wife. Who was she? And he gets into this in further detail.
Cain's wife. Who was she?
In the Bible, in the New Testament, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 45, that Adam was the first man. Now, in the first book of the Bible, Genesis, in chapter 3 and verse 20, we read that Eve was to be the mother of all the living. So according to the Bible, all human beings alive today, all human beings that have ever lived, are descendants of one man and one woman, Adam and Eve. There is only one race of human beings. Skeptics of the Bible often ask, if God made Adam and Eve, and they had 3 sons, Cain, Abel, and Seth, as recorded in Genesis, then where did Cain get his wife? Well, Genesis chapter 5, verse 4 records that Adam had other sons and daughters. In fact, Jewish tradition is they had over 50 children. That means originally, brothers would have had to have married sisters. Now people say, wait a minute, brothers aren't allowed to marry sisters. Even the Bible says that. Well, Abraham was married to his half-sister, and that wasn't a problem. Actually, it wasn't until the time of Moses that God said in Leviticus, no longer can close relatives marry. So why is it that close relatives could marry originally, but close relatives shouldn't marry today? When Adam was created, his genes were perfect. Eve's genes were perfect. But Adam sinned. And as a result of sin, God no longer holds everything together perfectly. So now everything runs down. The further away in relationship you are from each other, the more likely it is that you have different mistakes. And so when you get married and have children, you get a good gene from one partner with a bad gene from the other, and the good gene tends to mask the bad gene so it doesn't show up in the next generation to a great extent in the sense of a deformity or some major problem. But the further back you go in history, the less of a problem that is. You see, originally, Adam and Eve had no mistakes. Their children would have had relatively few. So provided it was one man for one woman, which is what the doctrine of marriage is all about, there was no problem with close relatives marrying originally. So you see, it's easy to understand, where did Cain get his wife? Cain's wife was one of his relatives, a close relative at that time, but one of his relatives, just as we marry our relative today.
What he's getting at is our relative, we're ultimately come from Adam and Eve, so we're all relatives in a longer term sense. And then let's talk about the firmament. And we get into how did the pre-flood world climate? How was it set up? So let's talk about God creating the firmament. And that's in Genesis 1, chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. Verse 6, then God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and divide the waters from the waters. Thus God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, so the evening and the morning were the second day. Then God said, let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures. Let the birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of the heavens. Note, the birds will fly across the face of the firmament of heaven, which can be considered the first heaven, which is the earth's atmosphere. So in Genesis, it teaches God made the firmament, which divided the waters which were under the firmament, or the land, from the waters which were above it. So a canopy of water overhead and water under the crust of the earth. There is another verse that talks about the second heaven. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night." Then God made two great lights. He made the stars also. Note, the stars are in the firmament of heaven, could be considered the second heaven, which is our solar system in outer space. And there's another verse that talks about the third heaven, 2 Corinthians 12, verse 2. "I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body I do not know, or whether out of the body I do not know, God knows, such a one was caught up to the third heaven." So it seems to be the Bible teaches three heavens: the atmosphere, outer space, and then the third heaven where the Lord seems to live. So a couple questions. What was it like? What was the weather like? What were the people like? What were the animals like before the flood? And how can a man live to be over 900 years old? On this longevity chart, let's see, do I have my... I might have lost it. Let's put the laser pointer back. Okay, so you can see on this, we have Adam, who lived 930 years. And then Seth lived to be 912 years. Enos, 905, and Canaan, 910. And Methuselah was the oldest person and lived to be 960 years old. Noah also lived to be 950. But I want you to look, that line right there is where the flood occurred. And notice the ages after Noah, the ages dropped off and people lived not as long. Something happened at the flood to change the way the age of human beings occurred. So, first of all, let's address how can this happen? Genesis 2, verse 5 and 6 teaches no rain, especially early on. So let's read what it says. Genesis 2:5. "Before any plant of the field was in the earth, and before any herb of the field had grown, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground. But a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. So God sent a mist up to water the earth." No rain occurred in the Garden of Eden. Now, I did want to tie in the rainbow covenant, because after the global flood, God made a covenant with man and sent his rainbow in the cloud. It didn't occur before the flood. It occurred after the flood. So let's read what these verses say. Genesis 9, verse 13. "And God said, 'This is a sign of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. And I will remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. The waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. The rainbow shall be in the cloud, and I will look on it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth.'" So that, to me, implies there weren't rainbows before the flood. God had the covenant of the rainbow after the flood, to have the covenant that he would not send a flood as bad as this again to destroy all flesh. So what a lot of Christian Sciences believes is, before the flood, you didn't have rain as we know it today. Probably no rainbows in the cloud, because the rainbow covenant came after the flood. So let's dive into how could that be. So today, the Earth's atmospheric layers, we have several layers. We have the troposphere. On this diagram is in the bottom part of the picture. The troposphere is where all the weather occurs. As a meteorologist, we focus on the lowest part of the troposphere. We do send weather balloons that penetrate the tropopause up into the stratosphere, but all our weather occurs in this lowest part of the atmosphere. The next layer is the stratosphere, and then the third layer is the mesosphere, the thermosphere, and then the exosphere. In the troposphere, which is this lowest layer here, the temperature falls with height. The higher you go up, the temperature drops. If you ever go up on top of a mountain, I remember I was mentioning earlier today when we went to Colorado this past August. It was 95 degrees in Denver. We went up to the top of the mountain at 10,000 feet. It dropped into the upper 60s, low 70s. It was amazing how the temperature falls. And when you go up in a plane, most of the planes are up at 30-some thousand feet. And if you ever look at the display in the plane, it'll say the temperature's 40, 50 below zero. So the temperature's dropping with height. And notice there's a picture on this diagram of a thunderstorm. Did you ever see a thunderstorm in the summertime where you see the big billowing cloud, the towering cumulus, and the updrafts send it all the way up to the top of the tropopause. And that's where the temperature goes from cooling with height to steady and warming again. So there is a lid on the lower atmosphere in the tropopause where thunderstorms can't rise much higher. Now you'll get strong updrafts where they'll just shoot through and have little overshooting tops, but then they'll spread out like an anvil shape, and you'll see that with a thunderstorm, where the overshooting top, it hits that barrier, and then the energy weakens and suppresses and equalizes at the tropopause. And you're seeing the atmosphere in action. And then the next layer is the stratosphere, and that's where the ozone is, and you notice this temperature, it's warming a little bit with height. Instead of cooling, it doesn't continue to cool, it starts warming, and that puts a lid on all weather, and the ozone warms the layer and prevents convection. So let's go to the next layer, and once we get above the stratosphere and go to the mesosphere, that's where it goes from warming slightly to cooling again. And this is where meteors slow or burn up, leaving trails in the night sky. And then above that layer, we hit the mesopause, and then it warms again. But what's interesting in the mesopause is this is where a possible ice canopy layer could have been in the pre-flood world, and we're seeing signs of that happening with space shuttle exhaust, and I'll show you a clip on that. But once we get to the thermosphere, it starts to warm up relatively and absorbs some of the UV and X-ray radiation from the sun, which helps warm that layer up. So that's kind of an overview of all the different atmospheric layers. Let's discuss atmospheric pressure. Creation scientists believe that the atmospheric pressure was stronger before the flood than it is today. So let's kind of do a 101 on what atmospheric pressure is. As I mentioned, temperature decreases with height. Pressure also decreases with height. As the elevation increases, the number of molecules, think of pressure as these little molecules. So they're condensed closer to the surface of the earth near sea level, but as we go up, they spread apart, and there's less pressure as you go up higher and higher. Result, the density of air is less the higher you go up in the atmosphere, and that causes a decrease in air pressure. And then if you ever gone on top of a mountain and you breathe in, there's less air and less pressure, and you feel lightheaded. We lived in Utah for 3.5 years, and when you cooked, cooking didn't take as long because it had an impact on when you would hit a golf ball, your ball would fly further because there was less pressure, and the ball you would have to ease off on the hits. So there's some advantage, but also there was more sun radiation, and you could be susceptible to more sunburns. And in fact, while the atmosphere extends more than 15 miles in the air, more than or half of the air molecules within the atmosphere are contained in the first 18,000 feet. So as you go higher and higher, there's less pressure and less molecules. So that's the concept that I wanted to leave. And the closer you are to sea level, the higher the pressure. So I want to go over this water canopy theory. The thinking was, in the pre-flood world, there was a strong temperature inversion. What I mean is the temperature, instead of decreasing with height, you go from Denver to the mountains, it goes from 95 to 68, it would actually increase with height, warm up. And the thinking was that there was an inversion before the flood, and then there would be impacts. With temperature warming with height, it would cause a very stable layer. You've seen in the summertime, we get high pressure, high dome of high pressure, it's light winds, and you don't really see too many clouds. So with this type of canopy theory, where there's an inversion, there will be no precipitation, clouds, or even rainbows in the sky. And with an inversion, you could trap the pressure and cause an increase in surface pressure, maybe even doubling it. So this would be ideal for a subtropical global weather conditions. And this is what the vapor canopy model, a theoretical construct, Dr. Joseph Willow, he came up with this concept and invented the pre-flood vapor canopy model. And I'm referencing the book that he wrote, The Waters Above, where he talked about God separating the waters from above the firmament. And he talked about a layer of water above the atmosphere that protected life on Earth. And it produced a significant greenhouse effect, resulting in subtropical warm weather all across the globe, and also no rainbows until after the flood. So this is what it would look like with a vapor canopy protecting the Earth, resulting in a near uniform temperature across the globe. There would be no four seasons like we see today, and with the poles not frozen. Basically, you would have almost uniform weather across the entire globe with this protection of a vapor canopy. To elaborate further on the greenhouse effect, that is when solar radiation coming into a greenhouse, the shortwave radiation penetrates the glass, hits the ground, goes back out, but the long-wave radiation stays trapped in here and it recycles and warms it up. The short wave leaves, but the long wave keeps warming up the greenhouse, reflecting and causing it to warm up. So just think of an entire globe like a big greenhouse with this vapor canopy, where it would warm up the entire globe, keep in constant temperatures. Didn't matter if you were at the North Pole or the equator. Dr. Larry Vardaman from Institute for Creation Research ran computer models to look at this in more depth. He looked at the thickness of the water canopy and adjusting the solar energy from hitting the canopy to see if our modern day computer models can simulate this actually occurring. And just to let you know, water vapor, you hear about CO2, carbon dioxide, it's a greenhouse problem. Did you know the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is like less than 1% of our atmosphere? Water vapor is the best greenhouse gas, and you can't stop water vapor. Running the model using the current solar radiation, it would warm up the temperature of the atmosphere too much. So he ran his model, and using that water canopy theory, he said it would warm up the surface of the Earth to 220 degrees, and boiling point's 212. So that would make the Earth not able to sustain life. However, he experimented with other scenarios to produce cooler conditions. He tried reducing the solar content. What if some of the energy from the sun hit the canopy or hit the earth and was reduced a certain percentage. Well, if you that could be due to a possible, what we call albedo effect with the ice crystals in the higher atmosphere. If you ever see in the wintertime snow, it's white, and it's so bright because what's happening is the snow is reflecting the solar radiation and making it so bright. Snow and ice are like almost, the purest snow is almost 100% albedo effect. It'll reflect the incoming solar radiation. That's why in the wintertime, if you have snow on the ground, the temperatures could fall really cold. If we could reduce the amount of solar radiation by 50%, it could be that ice crystal in the upper atmosphere, that could then produce a uniform temperature of 80 degrees at the equator and close to it all across the globe. So there is a mechanism using modern science to show that this could possibly happen. Now, I did want to also talk about the protective water canopy would shield the Earth from harmful solar X-rays and UV radiation. So what we have coming into the Earth is X-ray, UV radiation, visible light, and radio waves. So if you have protective canopy, that would reflect the harmful X-rays that come from the sun and also block the UV radiation that burns our skin and gives us cancer. In fact, what we're seeing even today, there were ice clouds forming from the shuttle's exhaust, and these clouds drifted towards the poles and float up there at minus 220 Fahrenheit at 51 miles above the Arctic. So we're already seeing these ice clouds that formed near the pole with our current structure. So it's not far-fetched to say with that water canopy and having a uniform ice shield that could have occurred back before the flood. So let's look at a diagram. So the Earth's crust, the original creation was very different from what we see today. The water vapor canopy, possible layer of clear ice. So there was a layer of water vapor and or ice above the atmosphere. And we get justification through Genesis 1:7. And God made the firmament divide the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And there was a layer, water under the Earth's crust, about a half mile thick. And we'll get into that. So you had water, the water canopy above the firmament, which is in the atmosphere, and then you also have water under the crust. And the thinking was that when the fountains of the great deep broke open, that's when we had all that water gushing and flooding the earth. And we'll get more into that next week. So a water layer would block out harmful X-rays from the sun, because the sun produces light, ultraviolet light, X-rays, gamma rays, and so forth. Here's a picture of an X-ray machine. Notice the technician is wearing a protective vest. Do you know why he's doing that? Anybody? He wants to block from the X-ray radiation impacting his body. And did you know that X-rays go through your body like bullets from a machine gun, sending thousands, if not millions of little tiny X-ray light beams to see your bones? So the X-rays expose what's in your body in reverse image. And the sun X-rays us every day of our lives, except on, like today, cloudy days. Good reflectors of sun X-rays are water vapor in the atmosphere, or cloudy days. So cloudy days help reflect the sun's X-rays. But the roof, if this was a sunny day, would not protect you from the sun's X-rays. So every sunny day we're getting the sun X-raying us and damaging our skin. Your skin feels the full force of the sun's X-rays. But God made your body to repair the skin damage. However, by the time you start getting into your late 60s, 70s, and 80s, something happens. Anybody knows what happens? You start losing the battle of the repair. And what do you think we get? Job 16:8, and thou hast filled me with wrinkles. So we start losing the body of damage repair. Now, unless you hold a lead or concrete umbrella above your head all the time to minimize exposure to the solar X-rays, there's nothing you can do. Now, most of the waters came from the fountains of the deep. There's still water under that crust of the earth today. Otherwise, there could be no hot water vents in the ocean floor, and we see hot water vents coming up today. So it's still there. We'll get more into that next week. Also, we have insects that are trapped in amber, which is petrified tree sap. And you know what we see in there? There's air bubbles. Air bubbles in that sap. And scientists have looked at those air bubbles that were trapped there, trapped the atmosphere before the flood. What they found out was 50% more oxygen occurred in those air bubbles than it does now. Some research said it had 35% oxygen. But if you look in the text box, it says they found it was 32% oxygen compared to what we have today, 21% in a modern atmosphere. So 50% more oxygen in the pre-flood world. Some PhD scientists, chemistry, material science, geochemistry, they said the only trend in the recent literature is the suggestion of far more oxygen in the early atmosphere than anyone imagined. So the sector scientists are agreeing. They're saying it's millions of years ago, but we believe the pre-flood world had more oxygen and higher pressure. What's the advantage of higher pressure? Well, under double atmospheric pressure, blood plasma will become oxygen saturated. The result, you could run far distance without getting tired, and increased oxygen will cause your body to heal much faster. I think people in the room, not the younger folks, but anyone remember baby Jessica McClure, who fell in the well in Texas in 1987? Yeah, a couple hands. She had one of her legs wrapped around her head in this well, and she was in this well 20 feet deep for 58 and a half hours. There's a picture of the media in Jessica's backyard during the rescue. She had lost circulation to some parts of her body, and you can see the picture there. Her arm was damaged, lost oxygen, and also they were planning to amputate her leg. One doctor suggested to amputate her leg. Another doctor recommended, let's place her in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber and see if that works. So they did put her in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber, and her leg and foot were saved because of this. They only amputated half of one little toe. And there's the People magazine talking about it 1 year later. And then there was Jessica at the White House as well, standing, and she didn't lose a limb. There must be something to hyperbaric chambers. Here's a hyperbaric chamber treating dive victims. In West Germany, all stroke patients are sent promptly for 3 weeks of intensive hyperbaric oxygen treatments paid for by insurance companies. Also, in England, over 6,000 multiple sclerosis patients are now being treated with hyperbaric oxygen. France, very rewarding results are being demonstrated in the treatment of arthritis and vascular necrosis, cirrhosis, and advanced liver disease, and so forth. Other countries, Japan, over 200 chambers, very promising work in the treatment of sudden deafness and blindness. Sweden, diabetic gangrene and Berger's disease. Belgium, reimplants of total extremities. India, using it for leprosy. Also, hyperbaric therapy helping young cerebral palsy patients. Also, patients who got extra oxygen were half as likely to be nauseated after surgery. Hudson Valley, New York, they treat the hyperbaric chamber with people who have autism and neurological disorders, and they've gotten remarkable results. Professional football teams are using hyperbaric chambers because healing time is nearly twice as fast, and if you're paying someone to be on the field making thousands of dollars per minute, you want them on the field performing. And this one's really interesting. Dr. Moro at Keio University in Tokyo raised tomato plants under a plastic greenhouse that filtered out UV light. He pressurized CO2 to the stems of the plant. and it was a cherry tomato plant. Within 2 years, one cherry tomato plant grew 16 feet tall and produced 800 tomatoes. After 16 years, they had to build the scaffolding you see, and is reported to be 45 feet tall and produce 15,000 tomatoes. And it's further reported that under these conditions, the tomatoes would stay green until they're picked. So if the world before the flood had higher oxygen, like we're seeing in the tree sap, pressurized with the canopy, and an inversion, look at the benefits it could give. There must have been orders of magnitude more plants on this earth today based on the amount of coal that we see in the ground. We're realizing that we don't have enough trees today to accommodate how much coal's in the ground underneath our feet. Dr. Eugenie Scott, Executive Director of the National Center for Science Education, developed a national recognized clearinghouse for information to advise to keep evolution in the science classroom and scientific creationism out. Also, Andrew Carnegie, a steel tycoon, founded and financed this education center and stated their purpose is to keep creation out of public schools. In a radio debate with Dr. Eugenie Scott and with Kent Hovind, who I'm referencing material today, they had a debate, and she said there's 80 separate layers of coal in the Midwest. Well, she's right, and there's a picture. If you look at the amount of coal in the whole world, the entire biomass of the world today could not possibly converted to that much fossil fuel. She's right again. There had to be an enormous amount of time involved in laying down the coal seams. Well, there she's wrong. She has an evolutionary worldview, and that was all buried with the worldwide flood. So the pre-flood world was probably loaded with bigger trees from pole to pole, and there's a diagram of what the world or the globe could have looked like. Because the thinking is with creation scientists is there weren't big oceans, and most of the land masses were connected. And we'll talk about that more next week. So due to the tropical hyperbaric increased oxygen conditions under the canopy, the enhanced environment enabled the pre-flood world plants to grow much larger than today. Less oceans, more water underneath the surface of the earth, and under the firmament of the land causing bigger trees from pole to pole. We see the massive coal seams today from Montana down through Wyoming. Strip mines have coal seams up to 200 feet or 60 meters thick. Now, let's start transitioning. If the whole globe was warm and trees were growing everywhere, what about the poles? I want to give you a perspective. This is a picture of the Antarctic max sea ice extent with both the continent of Antarctica and the sea ice around it. And you can see it's pretty massive underneath the globe. How thick is the ice at the South Pole? The dome of the polar ice cap is 3 miles thick at the deepest point. 3 miles of ice on Antarctica. And the South Pole stands on top of 1.7 miles of ice. 90% of the world's ice and approximately 91% of fresh water is locked up in Antarctic ice sheet. If all the ice were to melt in an instant, the level of the world's ocean could rise 196 feet. Antarctic ice sheets. The Antarctic ice sheet is one of the 2 polar ice caps of the Earth. It covers about 90% of the Antarctic continent and is the largest single mass of ice on Earth, with an average thickness of 1.2 miles. The Antarctic ice sheet covers an area almost 5.4 million square miles and weighs about 24.4 million gigatons. It holds approximately 61% fresh water on the Earth. The other quote was how much water for Antarctica. The coldest reliable measurable temperature on Antarctica was, any guesses? How cold was the coldest temperature in Antarctica? Anybody want to throw out a number? Has to be below 0. Too warm. No, that's getting that's a little bit better. 128.6 below zero. That was measured on July 21st, 1983. For comparison, that's 19 degrees warmer than dry ice. But that's measured because that's a big continent. Satellite measurements have identified even lower ground temperatures with 135.8 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. So at the South Pole, guess what the highest temperature ever recorded at the South Pole? What's the highest temperature ever recorded? Any guesses? It's above zero. No, South Pole. The warmest ever recorded. Any guesses? It's positive. You nailed it. 9.9. It happened on Christmas 2011. That's the warmest 10 degrees on the South Pole. And I have a picture of the ice sheet on the land and near the seashore. Incredible how much ice is there. When you see that much ice, I wanted to impress upon you, after considering those massive ice sheets and how high they are on Antarctica and extreme cold temperatures, even colder than dry ice, how can scientists find fossils of, first of all, dinosaurs, they found that, and deposits of leaves? How could leaves grow on a continent that's got miles high of ice? But if we consider the pre-flood subtropical climate from pole to pole, we now can understand how there could be leaves and trees on the side of a cliff that they found, and this is what the article says, not far from the South Pole. Here's the article. In January, Mr. Webb, with David Harwood, an assistant professor geology at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, they found in Australia a deposit of leaves on the side of a cliff in a desolate stretch of a trans-Antarctic mountains about 250 miles or 400 kilometers from the South Pole. And this is from an article that says, scientists report finding fossils of dinosaurs in the Antarctica's interior. So more evidence that there were trees, dinosaurs, and a warmer climate before the miles of ice built up. Also, this article, and I looked at it today, it's still there, ancient fossil forest unearthed not at the South Pole, but close to the North Pole. This is Arctic Norway. And UK researchers have unearthed ancient fossil forests thought to be partly responsible for one of the most dramatic shifts in Earth's climate in the past, 400 million years. That's evolutionary thinking. In the past 4,000 years. The fossil forests with tree stumps preserved in place and were found in this Norwegian location near the Arctic Ocean. They also found the forests were extremely dense with very small gaps around 8 inches between each of the trees. And this location is currently one of the most northernmost inhabited areas in the world with a population of 2,500. Now let's start talking about man being intelligent. Primitive man, before the flood man. Genesis 4:22 talks about it. And as for Zillah, she also bore Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. And what do we find? We find Max Han was fishing with his family near London, Texas in 1934, and he found a rock with wood protruding from it. When the rock was cracked open, this octagonally shaped iron hammer was exposed. The wood handle was partially coalified with quartz and calcite. The density tests indicate casting of exceptionally quality, unique coating of ferrous oxide, which does not readily form under present atmospheric conditions, and appears to inhibit rusting. So, there's your evidence of ancient man being intelligent enough that what they found in the rock was something made of bronze and iron, evidence of a hammer before the flood. And man was intelligent enough to make it. But also, check this out. When they brought it to the lab, it had 96.6% iron, 2.6% chlorine, and 0.74% sulfur. And they can't create that today. Man was so intelligent before the flood, we can't even make it or reproduce it today. It doesn't even rust. It's amazing. This bell was found inside a lump of coal in Bridgeport, West Virginia in 1944. Check on what's on top of it. It's a birdman from Hindu worship. This was buried in coal underneath the ground with the flood, and they were worshiping a birdman similar to Hindu worship. Of course, the textbook says the Carboniferous period was 250 million years ago. But that goes against the evolutionary thinking because man, even in their timeline, didn't exist. So how could that be created? The book I mentioned earlier, in the Morrison Times, a lump of coal embedded within a circular shape of small gold chain about 10 inches in length, and with workmanship, they found that. Also, there's a cast iron pot found in coal in 1912 in the electric plant in Thomas, Oklahoma. And that was buried in the pre-flood world because they had cast iron pots back then. They found this 4.5-inch high zinc and silver vessel found in supposedly 600 million year old strata, that was part of the pre-flood world and what they created. Here's a clay doll. They did a well drilling in Nampa, Idaho in 1889. And a rock layer supposedly 12 million years ago. And interesting that, even before the flood, they made dolls for their children, just like we would for our kids. Also, they found a Folsom blade embedded in a layer of rock from Sandia Cave, New Mexico. This rock layer was supposed to be 250,000 years old. They found a mortar and pestle in a California mine with rock deposits said to be 33 to 55 million years old. And they found it deep in the mine shaft under disturbed layers of lava. But I did want to highlight the Smithsonian Gate, and I have a book up here that I mentioned earlier about giants, missing skeletons, these artifacts they're finding in the coal that prove that there was man that existed, and supposed to be millions of years old. That's all being hidden. Also, even when they report on it, the director of the museum was fired for refusing to fire the discoverer. Discoverer of an artifact turned it into the museum, and they were told, fire that guy because we can't have something go through our rewriting of our evolutionary books. It would have forced the rewriting of almost every book in the business. This coin-like object was from a well boring near Lawn Ridge, Illinois, a depth of 114 feet. According to information supplied by the Illinois State Geological Survey, the deposits containing the coin are between 200,000 400,000 years old. These are coins from the pre-flood world as well. Looks like this has some animal-like creature. So it shows that maybe they're worshiping, animals. A shoe sole from Nevada. There's a stitching pattern clearly visible, including the twist of the thread. And it was inside rock that's supposedly 213 to 248 million years ago, but it was a shoe. This one's probably the most amazing of all. They found hundreds, not just one, hundreds of metallic spheres from South Africa and what's called Precambrian mineral deposits, said to be 2.8 billion years old. The spheres of the two types were bluish metal with white flecks, and they had these 3 parallel grooves along the equator. And this is what the curator of the museum said. The spheres are a complete mystery. They look man-made, yet at the time in the Earth's history when they came to rest in this rock, no intelligent life existed. They're nothing like I have ever seen before. And they found it in 2.8 billion year old mineral deposit. And they said it was made by an intelligent being. So the flood buried that world. Did you know today the Earth is 70% underwater? Much of the rest is desert, ice caps, tundra, treeless mountain ranges. Only 3% is habitable for man. Now we'll get into giants. Genesis 6:4. There were giants on the earth in those days. The tallest man in the Guinness Book of World Records is Robert Wadlow from Alton, Illinois. He was 8 feet 11 and 1/4 inches and died in 1940. The picture on the right is his father on the right and his brother on the left, and you can see how tall he was. He had a size 37 shoe, and there's a picture of him next to a man with size 11 shoe. Now, the tallest man today is this Sultan Kozan, 8 foot 2.8 inches. He's from Mardin, Turkey. He's age 40. There were tall people in the past. The Roman Emperor Maximinus was 8 feet 6 inches tall, 2.5 meters. They found a femur, a 47-inch human femur they dug up. And this thigh bone, if you connect the dots, would have been a giant 16 feet tall. In fact, the thigh bone is right there, and you can see how tall that guy would have been that they found in the fossil record. So there were giants in those days, up to 16 feet tall. Here's a drawing of 11 foot 6 inch man from an Italian coal mine, buried beneath heavy layers of shell some 30 miles under the city of Shreveport, Louisiana. They found huge bones, many as 20 skeletons found intact. Every skeleton was 9 feet high. 9 foot 8 inch tall person in Brewersville, Indiana in 1879. In July 24, 2000, Kent Hovind interviewed a person. He's vacationing in Virginia City, Nevada. He went to a small private museum where he saw 2 skeletons 9 feet tall in a glass-covered pit. The owner had found them in a cave nearby. About 10 years later, he stopped to see the skeletons, but the owner told him someone from the government had taken them and would not return them. A skeleton nearly 10 feet long was found in Humboldt Lake, Nevada bed, June 1931. In South Bend, Indiana, a group of amateur archaeologists opened a mound in 1925 and unearthed skeletons of 8 giants ranging from 8 to 9 feet long. They were wearing heavy copper armor. Though the bungling of these diggers and the total disinterest of the archaeological museum establishment, these discoveries have now been scattered and lost. A skeleton 12 feet tall was reported in many papers in Tucson, Arizona in 1891, and a man had 6 toes, long hair, and a bird-shaped headdress. 12-foot giant fossil bones in Eureka, Nevada. And from an intriguing aspect of the bones, from knee to heel, they measured 39 inches. Their owner in life said they stood over 12 feet tall. There were 10-foot giants and 7 other giants, including 8 feet plus women in Ohio. They unearthed a woman that was 7 foot tall with an infant in a cave. Also, they had a painting of a pterodactyl-like animal in the cave. Not only were the people big and living longer, the insects, reptiles, animals, and fish were big also. Rhinoceros, 18 feet tall in University of Nebraska Museum. And the canopy of water overhead would increase air pressure, allow insects to grow larger, because insects breathe through their skin. Today's bugs are limited to the size amount of oxygen and air pressure. Insects breathe through spiracles in their skin, not nostrils. Bugs growing in the oxygen-rich waters grow up to 1,000 times heavier than those living off of Europe. Here is a fossil 50-inch wingspan, 50-inch, that's over 4 feet, of a dragonfly fossil found in Italy. And here's a smaller version, a 29-inch dragonfly wingspan that this guy put a model for. Imagine if that hit your car. The largest cockroach today is a giant hissing cockroach. It can grow up to 3.6 inches long. In comparison, the American cockroaches only vary from a half inch to 1.2 inches. The cockroach in the pre-flood world were 20 inches long, or 50 centimeters. Imagine trying to hit one of those cockroaches if it was in your cupboard. Centipedes 8.5 feet long were found in the fossil record. You have to get a shotgun to kill it. Grasshoppers 2 feet long have been found, bigger than cats. And there's a picture if you lived in the pre-flood world, if you were hunting grasshoppers, how big they would be. Giant tarantula found in the fossil record. Bigger than that guy's hand. Cattail 60 feet long, found in sedimentary rock. Donkey excavated Lubbock, Texas, 9 feet high at the shoulder. Giant sloths lived before the flood. Buffalo horns, 12-foot span. You can see up here the world's largest bison and how long the horns were. Giant elk, 12-foot antlers. Kangaroos, as tall as 10 feet or 3.4 meters. Ancient rodents the size of buffaloes. Here's a bird the height of 13 feet. This is a prehistoric egg next to an ostrich egg, which is the largest today. We got a giant prehistoric goose that stood as tall as an elephant and weighed a half a ton. Fossils of beavers over 8 feet long were found. There's a jaw of a 7 to 8 foot beaver he has in his hand. Skull of a 6 foot long beaver. Salamanders only grow 5.5 to 8 inches long. We have a fossil record of a 6 foot long salamander. So the canopy of water would increase air pressure, put more air into the water, allow more and bigger fish to live. Here's one they found today, 646-pound catfish in Thailand. Sharks growing 80 feet long before the flood. Megalodon. There's a tooth up here on the left. The tooth was 7 inches in length, and there is his jaw size. A guy easily be swallowed up. In fact, the megalodon was larger than a bus, and you could use a great white shark as bait. So the pre-flood world had much stronger magnetic field. Dr. Ball raising piranha, 4 times larger than normal size with increased pressure using pre-flood conditions. Also, we have a sea turtle bigger than a man, and we're almost closing up. A couple more slides. Oysters. Oysters 11.5 feet wide. They're found, guess where? The top of the Andes Mountains, 2 miles in elevation. Do oysters climb mountains? No. We'll talk about how they got up there next week. But they're on top of the Mount Everest. We have sea creatures that once lived in the sea are also found on the top of the highest mountain in the world. So we have all these shells of sea creatures. And how would sea creatures get at Mount Everest when the nearest beach is 450 or 700 kilometers away? Also, why are the clams shut? Because if you ever look on the seashore, clams open when they die. So that's all I have. Before I close, any questions? Yes, Pat?
Mark, would you say that based on the barometric pressure and the oxygen content and so on, that men and women were much stronger before the flood, could do maybe much greater as far as strength and do things that we can't do today?
Just remember, God created Adam and Eve perfect. The intent was for them to live forever until they sinned. There's speculation that Noah and his sons were large men, not 16 feet large, but bigger than we are today, living under those pressure, the higher pressure, better oxygen, no genetic flaws in their body, living to be not. Yeah, and the thinking is, and we'll get into that in December, the details, but they probably contracted work out just like they did at the Ark encounter. They contracted to non-believers. They showed pictures of, atheists who they'll work for money. So maybe Noah contracted out help in his day, even though they didn't become believers and go into the Ark. But yeah, probably the people before the flood were healthier than us, stronger than us, bigger than us. They were taking in that higher pressure, more oxygen, living longer. It's hard to even fathom what they went through versus us. And look at all those animals, how big they were. It's easy to assume that man and women were much bigger too. Any other comments or questions?
They ate better food.
Yes, they ate better food. They were vegetarians. They ate fruit and vegetables. No, they weren't allowed till after they got off the ark. At least those who followed God. We'll talk about that coming up, but I'll give a short. The coal deposits, talk about Mount St. Helens. When Mount St. Helens erupted, it knocked out all those trees and it went into Spirit Lake. And the bark came off the trees and formed at the bottom of Spirit Lake. And coal was starting to form down there. So the thinking is, with the trees that were massive compared to what we have today, so all the bark, the leftover timber, and also being covered with tsunami wave and mud and deposits, squished that bark and caused these coal seams. We don't have enough trees today to do it, and that's what even the secular scientists say. So there was much more trees back then than there are today. So hopefully that answers it. Any others? So, I have a couple quiz questions. They're pretty easy. Who was Cain's wife? There you go. Very good. Quick synopsis. What was the weather like before the global flood? Yeah. Right. Warm. Okay, good. How did people live so long? There you go. Yeah. Thanks for tying in the X-rays. Yep. And did tropical trees grow in the Arctic? We have the evidence, even though it seems impossible today. Imagine if you're a non-believer, secular scientist, it'd be hard to believe that. And were man and animals larger than today? Okay. That's it. I thank you for your attention.